The roar of the sea carried a weight of destiny as two fleets circled one another across the open waters, one carrying the pride of Britannia and the other the hopes of an emperor whose ambition had no borders. The clash was not just of wood and iron, but of nations and futures, a moment where history might split into two very different paths. For years, Napoleon had stretched his hand across the continent, toppling kingdoms and crowning himself master of Europe. Yet always across the Channel stood an island fortress that refused to bend. England, protected by her ships and the restless waves, was the thorn in his side, the prize that eluded his grasp, the fortress he dreamed of breaking. The French and their Spanish allies had gathered an armada, proud ships painted with the colors of empire. Their orders were clear: unite, break the blockade, and prepare the way for the greatest gamble of the age, an invasion of the British Isles. It was an ambition fed by the failures of sanctions and blockades, for no embargo could bring England to her knees. Only conquest could, and Napoleon's eyes were fixed upon that dream. Admiral Nelson, scarred from battles past, a man who carried both legend and burden upon his shoulders, was tasked with breaking that dream. His orders were simple: pursue, engage, and destroy. Yet simplicity often hides storms of complexity. Across the Atlantic, the fleets danced, shadows on the horizon, sails white against blue. A game of patience, waiting for the winds, waiting for the mistake. It was October, the winds weak, the sea sluggish, every maneuver heavy, every order slow to take effect. Yet at last the fleets found themselves near Cadiz, where fate had brought them into each other's jaws. The Franco-Spanish commanders sought to retreat, to find the safety of harbor, but Nelson pressed, refusing to let them slip away, refusing to let the dream of invasion take one more breath. Here, Nelson made a choice that defied tradition. He would not line his ships side by side, trading fire until exhaustion. Instead, he ordered a direct thrust, headlong into the enemy line, a spear of oak and iron aimed at the heart of the armada. Such defiance was reckless, yet greatness often is. But imagine now if things had turned. If the Franco-Spanish captains, instead of floundering, found cohesion, if their line held firm, if their guns, many more than the British carried, opened as one against the daring spear of Nelson. Picture Victory, his flagship, battered before it could even fire a broadside, splinters tearing through decks, masts groaning, the admiral himself falling before the first clash could even truly begin. Panic would ripple through the British fleet, hesitation, doubt, the kind that no order can fully silence. Some captains might turn away, others charge too late, others fall into disorder. The strength of Britain, its seamless naval discipline, broken in a single brutal blow. The result not the triumph remembered in our timeline, but the shattering of Britain's shield at sea. Half the fleet sunk or captured. Nelson gone, the Channel now open to Napoleon's plans. Such a moment would not see London fall tomorrow, but the path would be laid. For without command of the seas, Britain stood naked, vulnerable, the fortress exposed at last. And what then? How far would Napoleon go? How far would Marshall's march? And what kind of Britain would stand when the thunder of war crossed its shores? The story from this point becomes not the quiet victory of one nation's defense, but the storm of invasion, the clash of empire with island, and the rewriting of destiny itself.
The news of Nelson's fall spread like fire through Europe. In taverns and courts alike, men whispered of the unthinkable. Britannia, defeated at sea, the island no longer untouchable, the dream of invasion reborn in the mind of Napoleon. The emperor wasted no time. He turned his eyes from Vienna and Austerlitz to the cliffs of Dover, to the beaches of Hastings, to the prize that had mocked him for years. The French army was no ordinary host. It was a machine of iron discipline and burning ambition, drawn from every corner of Europe, veterans of Italy, Egypt, and the Rhine, men who had followed their general through snow and sand alike, hardened, loyal, and hungry. Napoleon had long prepared them for this moment, drilling along the northern coast, watching across the waters for the signal to embark, the Grande Armée swelling like a tide held back by walls of stone. England prepared too, for even in victory she had always feared the shadow of French sails on the horizon. The coast bristled with towers of stone, cannons watching the waves, canals dug deep into the earth, villages turned into fortresses. Signal towers lined the south coast, each one ready to blaze the warning fires that could reach London in hours. This was not a land asleep. This was a land standing tense, watching, waiting. Yet defense is only as strong as the shield that guards it, and with the fleet crippled, the shield had shattered. Napoleon knew it, his marshals knew it, and so the plan moved forward. In the dark of winter, supplies gathered, ships repaired, orders whispered from Paris to Calais. The channel was treacherous, the storms fierce, but the promise was worth every risk. One crossing, one landing, one foothold on English soil could change the destiny of empires. But the emperor was not content to strike one blow alone, for he understood war was not only about soldiers and steel, but about hearts and doubts. He looked across the sea not just to England, but to Ireland, the restless island where rebellion had flared only years before, where resentment simmered against British rule, and where a spark could set the countryside aflame. Napoleon planned not merely an invasion, but a fracture, a tearing apart of Britain's strength from within and without. So while the main fleet readied itself for the great crossing, smaller armadas slipped quietly from French ports, carrying seasoned troops and promises of freedom to Irish rebels. The green fields of the west coast soon saw French boots and banners, a sight that sent shivers through Dublin and London alike. Towns rose in defiance, British garrisons faltered, and the island that Britain had held with iron was now a bleeding wound, another front to drain soldiers and ships away from the south coast defenses. The king, fragile in mind, declared bravely that he would meet Napoleon himself if the French landed. But the real command of the kingdom lay with his generals, John Moore, who had built the towers and the canals, and the Duke of York, who had tasted failure in Flanders but learned bitter lessons from it. They moved men, ships, and guns as best they could, but even the most careful hand could not cover every shore. Not when the enemy struck in Ireland, in the Channel, and perhaps even beyond. The people of Britain felt the weight of dread. Whispers filled marketplaces. What if the French came? What if the towers failed? What if London itself fell? Merchants feared the ruin of trade. Farmers feared armies marching through their fields. Mothers feared the sound of foreign drums on English soil. And in every church, prayers rose for protection against the storm they could not stop. Across the waters, Napoleon walked among his men, speaking with the soldiers as if each were his brother, reminding them of Italy, of Egypt, of how victory had followed them everywhere. He told them that England was the final stone, the fortress whose fall would make Europe whole. He painted visions of glory, of treasure, of history itself bending before them, and the soldiers roared with belief, their eyes fixed upon the white cliffs that glimmered faintly across the channel. Winter turned to spring, storms eased, and on the coast of France the Armada grew restless, sails like a forest, masts creaking, drums echoing across the camp. Officers checked and rechecked supplies. Soldiers rehearsed the landing. Cannons rolled into place, and still the winds held them back, until at last in early summer the skies cleared, the waters calmed, and Napoleon gave the order, the long-awaited command that would set the world aflame.
The first French landings came swift and sharp, sails like shadows upon the dawn, the roar of cannon shattering the morning calm. Villages along the southern coast awoke to thunder and flame. Families rushed inland as soldiers marched ashore, banners unfurled, muskets gleaming, and the tricolor rising over English sand. The invasion that had once been a fear was now a truth. At Eastbourne, the French came first, a massive flotilla unloading men by the thousands, their boots churning the sand into mud, their officers urging them forward toward the inland roads. Napoleon himself set foot on the shore, his presence like a storm given form. He wasted no time in speeches or ceremony. His orders were crisp: seize the town, break the defenses, and spread out before the British could gather strength. Every hour mattered, every delay gave the enemy breath. To the east, Marshal Ney pushed toward Hastings with 6,000 men, eager, relentless, his columns moving fast along the coastal roads, their drums echoing like war's own heartbeat. To the west, Napoleon held the bulk of the army, ready to strike Brighton, a city he knew would resist, yet also a prize that would open the gates to London. And behind them, the French fleet clashed with what remained of the Royal Navy, not to win, but to delay, to hold the seas long enough for the landing to take root. The British did not crumble. Signal towers flared, guns thundered from stone fortresses, militias mustered from towns and villages, and John Moore himself marched with reinforcements to meet the threat. At Hastings, his 23,000 men fell upon Ney's force like a hammer. The clash was brutal, smoke and fire choking the air, yet British artillery tore through French lines, cavalry thundered from the flanks, and Ney, though brave and unyielding, was cut down. His army shattered, his ambition ending on English soil. The first victory for Britain, the first proof that the island would not be taken easily. Yet victories are often bought dearly. While Ney fell at Hastings, Napoleon pressed against Brighton, his artillery pounding the defenses, his veterans storming the walls, and though the Duke of York rallied the defenders with determination, the French weight was immense. Every street became a battlefield, every stone contested, and by nightfall, much of the city lay in flames. The cost was horrific, yet Napoleon stood upon the hills east of the ruins and declared the way to London open. Still, the invasion was not a single thrust, but many. Across Norfolk, the flamboyant Marshal Murat led 15,000 cavalry, landing at Great Yarmouth, his horsemen spreading across the countryside like wildfire, raiding villages, cutting roads, sowing fear. The English flatlands gave him space to gallop unhindered, and his raids forced the Crown to scatter troops in every direction, never knowing where the next strike would fall. This chaos was Napoleon's design. Every raid, every landing, every spark of rebellion in Ireland tearing Britain thinner and thinner. For in Ireland, the French foothold grew, Devat and Soult driving their columns across the green fields, Irish rebels rallying to their banners, towns falling in swift succession, British garrisons stretched and bleeding, the rebellion becoming more than whispers, it became a flame. And London trembled as two wars now burned, one across the sea and one on the very soil of the Isles. Parliament thundered with arguments. Some demanded a counterstrike, others demanded fortifications, but all knew the truth. Britain was bleeding from many cuts. The shield of the Navy was broken, the enemy was ashore, and no single decision could guard every coast. The nation's survival hung upon the speed of its generals, the loyalty of its people, and the chance of turning the tide before Napoleon's momentum became unstoppable. Amid this chaos, the French played their final card. More fleets setting sail from Calais, from Brest, from The Hague, waves of transports, each carrying thousands more soldiers. And though one was intercepted, torn apart by what remained of British sea power, others broke through. More men, more cannon, more banners planting themselves upon English ground. The tide swelled higher, the invasion deepened, and London grew closer with each step. The British people clung to hope. They sang songs of defiance in taverns. They raised militias in villages. They swore oaths before church altars that no foreign tyrant would rule them. Yet fear shadowed every word, for the French were not raiders to be chased away. They were an empire, seasoned, organized, and led by a man whose genius had already humbled half of Europe. The question now was not whether the French could land, for they had, but whether the island could withstand their storm long enough for fortune to turn. At Eastbourne, the French victory emboldened Napoleon. His men cheered him as a conqueror, but even he knew the fight was far from finished, for Hastings had shown the British could bite, and he prepared for the great clash he knew must come, the battle that would decide not just cities or ports, but the fate of kingdoms. The fields of southern England awaited, and upon them, destiny itself would be written in smoke and blood.
The summer sky over England darkened with smoke as armies converged upon the south, Napoleon gathering his marshals, the Duke of York and John Moore rallying every regiment they could muster. The countryside was no longer a land of farms and villages. It had become a chessboard of empires, each hill a fortress, each road a vein of blood life. And at its heart stood London, trembling yet defiant, the city whose fate would decide the world. Napoleon knew that speed was his greatest ally, for the longer the British mustered their strength, the harder his path would become. He ordered his veterans to seize the hills east of Brighton, cannon dragged into position, muskets braced, banners fluttering against the wind. Here he would force the English to meet him. Here he would carve his mark into the island's soil. The emperor moved among his men, calm and assured, promising them that one more great victory would seal not only their glory, but the fate of Europe itself. The British came in force, John Moore leading 23,000, the Duke of York bringing yet more behind him. Their lines bristled with artillery, their cavalry restless and ready to charge. The fields trembled beneath the weight of preparation. Prayers whispered, orders shouted, drums rolling like thunder before the storm. Both sides knew this was no skirmish, this was not a raid. This was the battle that would decide whether the Channel was a barrier once more or a bridge forever broken. The clash began with fire. French artillery roaring, British guns answering, the air filled with smoke so thick that day became dusk, ranks of infantry advancing, the crack of muskets rolling like waves across the field. The French pressed hard upon the British right, Marshal Lannes charging forward with fearless precision, his men crashing into redcoats with bayonet and blade. The line wavered, the ground drenched in blood, yet the British held. Their artillery cutting gaps through French ranks, their cavalry countering with thunderous charges that shook the earth beneath hooves. For hours the battle raged, each side trading ground for lives, Brighton itself smoldering behind them, its ruins a reminder of what was already lost. Napoleon rode close to the front, his presence a pillar for his soldiers, urging them onward, reminding them that England itself waited behind those hills. He saw weakness, he saw the right flank bending, and he hurled his reserves into the breach, the tide crashing harder, the weight of France pressing to break the line at last. But Britain was not yet beaten. John Moore directed his guns with ruthless clarity, volleys of grape shot tearing through columns, the Duke of York riding among the men, rallying them with shouts of defiance. And when the moment came, they unleashed their cavalry, squadrons of horse sweeping across the fields, cutting into French flanks, scattering columns, turning what had seemed unstoppable into chaos. The French reeled, not broken, but bloodied, their advance slowed, their momentum checked. Night fell with neither side holding true victory. The field at charnel ground of the dead and the dying, cries of the wounded echoing through the smoke, both armies battered yet unbroken. Napoleon withdrew to the hills, his men weary but still burning with loyalty. The British held the field but at a cost so grave that triumph felt hollow, yet in London bells rang. For England still stood, and the people clung to the fragile hope that the island might endure. In the days that followed, the struggle only deepened. Reinforcements from Ireland stretched thin, Murat's raids and Norfolk still cutting supply lines, French fleet still landing men upon scattered shores. Yet the heart of the invasion had been slowed, the dream of a swift march upon London delayed. And in that delay, Britain found breath. Allies stirred across Europe, whispers in Prussia and Russia, murmurs in Austria, all watching to see if the island would fall or if the tide could be turned. For Napoleon, the invasion was both triumph and torment. He had set foot on English soil. He had broken the myth of an untouchable Britain, yet the victory he craved eluded him. Each mile gained was bought with blood. Each city resisted. Each day gave his enemies time to rally. He had come as conqueror and liberator, yet he found not a land ready to bow, but a people fierce in their defense. And in the smoke of Brighton he glimpsed what even his genius could not guarantee, that destiny was not his alone to command. So the campaign dragged on, not the swift avalanche he had promised, but a grinding war across the fields of southern England. Villages burned, castles refitted into strongholds, canals turned into barriers of mud and steel. The Channel behind him a dangerous lifeline, the armies before him stubborn, unyielding, unwilling to let the crown fall. The invasion had begun with thunder and fire, yet its end lay shrouded in uncertainty, for even emperors could not dictate the will of a people who refused to surrender.